Welcome to the Italian Culture Institute. We're truly delighted to host you on the occasion of the exhibit Caravaggio, Masterpieces from the Galleria Borghese, this intimate and very engaging lecture led by Davide Gasparotto, Senior Curator of Paintings at the Getty Museum, who curated also the Caravaggio exhibit. The exhibit is currently on display at the Getty Center through February the 18th, so we warmly invite you to not to miss it. Davide Gasparotto began his career as the director of the Piero della Francesca Foundation and spent the following 12 years as a curator and art historian at the National Gallery in Parma. He was appointed director of the Galleria Stenze in Modena in September 2012, before joining the Getty Museum. This event, of course, is organized with the Getty Museum, and I would like to extend my deep gratitude not only to Davide Gasparotto, of course, very grateful for his very kind collaboration and for joining us here at the Institute, and also John Giurini, Assistant Director for Public Affairs at the Getty Museum. As a courtesy to others, I'd like to ask you please to turn off your cell phones during the presentation. And I'd also like to invite you next week on January the 16th. We'll have a very special meeting with Eri De Luca and Paolo Sassone Corsi. And Eri De Luca, for the people who don't know him, is a very acclaimed Italian novelist, and we'll be in conversation with Paolo Sassone Corsi, who is a well-known scientist here in California at UC Irvine. That will be on January the 16th. Now please join me in welcoming Davide Gasparotto.
Yes. Thank you very much, Valeria. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I really hope that my lecture will be intimate and engaging. And so I structure the lecture in sort of 4 chapters, like a sort of a piece of theater. One prologue where I'll address some more general questions and insights about Caravaggio, and 3 acts, 3 chapters, 3 other chapters, following in some way the 3 most important moments in Caravaggio's career. So, in the summer of 1610, all Rome was awaiting the return of the painter Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, who 4 years earlier had been banished and condemned to death for killing a man in a brawl. Now, pardoned by the Pope, he had left Naples for Rome with a boat. But his journey became a series of desperate misadventures, and alone and destitute, the most celebrated painter in Italy died of a fever at the small fortress town of Porto Ercole, north of Rome, which you can see here in the slide, north of Rome on July 18, 1610. The news spreads rapidly, and one correspondent reported the death of this, I quote, famous painter, most excellent in coloring and imitation of nature. The poet Giambattista Marino honored him as the creator of a spellbinding illusionism, feared by both death and nature. Nature, he writes, was, and I quote, afraid from your hand would surpass it in every image you created, not painted. And this idea, this metaphor in some way of the artist as a creator, artist as a god, is something that goes back to classical antiquity and also to the Renaissance. So it's in some ways a topos, but it's interesting that it's used by Marino to celebrate Caravaggio. Caravaggio's life had been stormy. His art had caused passionate debate, and his belligerent nature and love of sword fighting got him into trouble with the police several times. To contemporaries, he seemed bizarre and unstable. Vain, touchy, and proud, he was feared as well as admired. An adjective that occurs in early sources to describe his character is stravagantissimo, which can be rendered as very strange, bizarre, eccentric. Stravagante is difficult to translate from the Italian, since its meaning depends on the context in which it is used. It always implies a transgression of normal behavior, from foibles and mild eccentricities to action bordering on and crossing the threshold of sanity. In Caravaggio's case, the use of the superlative stravagantissimo implies an unusual degree of extravagance, even for an artist. Caravaggio's quick temper and provocative speech were intimately implicated in the series of violent incidents that punctuated his life. Karel van Mander, he's sort of not really a biographer, but in his life of Northern painters, he included several important information about Caravaggio while Caravaggio was still living, because the book by Van Mander was published in 1604, and he had a sort of an informer in Rome, a painter, a Dutch painter who worked in Rome and knew personally Caravaggio. Karel van Mander wrote in 1604 that, about Caravaggio, he does not pursue his studies steadfastly, so that after a fortnight's work he will swagger about for a month or two with a sword at his side and with a servant following him, from one tennis court to the next, ever ready to engage in a fight or an argument, with the result that it is most difficult to get along with him. And then in this other passage, as you see, he says that Caravaggio is doing extraordinary things in Rome, and that this Michelangelo has already earned reputation, a good name and honor with his work. So at that point, 1604, Caravaggio was already pretty famous in Rome, and he was especially famous for his close imitation of nature. Some details of this account of Van Mander are verifiable from trial records and newspapers' reports. The former show that Caravaggio, which we can see here, a self-portrait of Caravaggio from one painting, which I will show you later on, a self-portrait painted around 1602. The former, so the trial account, show that Caravaggio was brought to trial no less than 11 times between October 1600 and September 1605. There was also a social we have to remember that there was also a social dimension to Caravaggio's delinquency, since he was often in the company of men who were as belligerent as he was. He moved in a bohemian circle, which included soldiers of the Papal Guard, a bookseller, a perfumer, and the Brescian painter Prospero Orsi, as well as the architect Onorio Longhi and the painter Orazio Gentileschi. A part of this bohemian attitude is also Caravaggio's sexual behavior. Documentary evidence points towards his having been bisexual. The only references to the matter in his lifetime indicated that he consorted with prostitutes and had a kept boy. A certain Lena, and I quote, who stood in Piazza Navona, was, according to a contemporary testimony, Caravaggio's girl, and for sure one of his models. And here you can see a portrait, which unfortunately was lost in Berlin during the Second World War, of Filli de Melandroni, who was a famous courtesan at the time in Rome, and was also the model for this painting with St. Catherine of Alexandria, painted around the end of the 16th century. While in his testimony of August 28, 1603, the painter Mausalini claimed that one of the people who distributed copies of the satirical verses against the painter Giovanni Baglione was a youth called Giovanni Battista, a bardassa of Caravaggio and Onorio Longhi. A bardassa was a bardash or catamite, a boy kept for sexual favors. Early sources indicate that the figure of the triumphant Cupid, painted for Marquis Vincenzo Giustiniani, or the young Saint John the Baptist, painted for Ciriaco Mattei, Two of the most prominent Caravaggio's patrons in Rome are probably portraits of il suo Caravaggino, his own little Caravaggio, that is one of Caravaggio's workshop assistants and lovers, Cecco del Caravaggio, who has been identified with the painter Francesco Boneri. The provocative ambiguity of both paintings has clearly sexual and homoerotic implications. Despite all the information about his life, for an artist of such fame, celebrated by his contemporary as a great innovator in the sphere of painting, Caravaggio left astonishingly few direct traces. In contrast to such artists such as Annibale Carracci, Rubens, Poussin, and Gian Lorenzo Bernini, not a single letter from the hand of Caravaggio has come down to us. Jacopo Bassano, Guercino, and Claude Lorrain all left detailed account books. Giampaolo Lomazzo, Federico Zuccari, and Giovanni Baglione left copious treatises. It is for this reason that our picture of Caravaggio is essentially based upon his early biographers. Contrary to received opinion, none of these was unreservedly hostile, and some were strongly affirmative. All praised his tremendous powers of imitation and his coloring. The first was Giulio Mangini, a physician from Siena and important collector, who knew the artist well in the period between 1595 and 1600, when he looked after him as a doctor. He passionately admired Caravaggio and saw clearly that the painter had breathed new life into a declining art in the last years of the 16th century. Second comes the account of Giovanni Baglione, mediocre painter, who was one of Caravaggio's rivals in the intensely competitive Roman art world, and the one against whom were directed the famous satirical verses distributed in town by Caravaggio's friends. Baglione was also one of the first to imitate Caravaggio's style and was attacked by the painter in a series of outrageously scurrilous verses, provoking his competitor into suing him for libel. And so from the acts of this process, we know a bit about Caravaggio's life in Rome in the early years of the 17th century. Baglione deserves credit for his objectivity, and his account has not been proved inaccurate. Yet it is mean-spirited, and he seizes the opportunity to disparage the artist, to describe his misfortunes with ill-concealed pleasure, and in the end to marginalize his achievement. And you can see here that he says, moreover, some people thought that he had destroyed the art of paintings. And then he criticized him for not allowing other artists to concentrate on drawings, but only being satisfied with the colors. So he's sort of criticizing some of Caravaggio's habits of painting. There followed in 1672 the influential life of Caravaggio by Giovan Pietro Bellori. Bellori's classicist belief that the artist should select the most beautiful parts of nature to create an idea of perfect beauty dictated his assessment of Caravaggio's art. To him, the most perfect combination of nature and art had been made by antique sculptures, and then by Raphael and Annibale Carracci, who was the greatest contemporary of Caravaggio. Bellori criticized Caravaggio's excessive dependence on the living model, and he condemned many of his religious pictures as undecorous. Nonetheless, Bellori appreciated Caravaggio's emotional power as a storyteller, and it is in his life that we found the most precise, moving, and even evocative descriptions of Caravaggio's paintings. The absence of personal testimony and the historiographical constellation described above have decisively shaped Caravaggio's critical fortunes and at the same time posed particular challenges to those who would study him. Since Caravaggio's 20th century rediscovery, and in particular since the groundbreaking exhibition in Milan in 1951, research has intensified enormously. And you can see here the cover of the catalog of the great famous 1951 exhibition in Milan, and the real soul of this exhibition was one of the greatest, probably the greatest Italian art historian of the 20th century, Roberto Longhi, which you can see here, who wrote a thesis on Caravaggio when he graduated in 1912. So he started studying Caravaggio and rediscovering Caravaggio during the first half of the 20th century. Yet, despite the increase in knowledge, our image of Caravaggio's historical figure has only become partially more defined and the subject of a number of seemingly irreconcilable interpretations. Some scholars see Caravaggio as the ardent representative of the Catholic reform in the spirit of Carlo Borromeo and San Filippo Neri, while others consider the artist an almost heretical libertine, opposed to church hierarchies and a champion of the new science in the sphere of Tommaso Campanella, Giordano Bruno, and Galileo Galilei. So two really totally contrasting interpretations are possible when we are looking at Caravaggio's paintings. Caravaggio was born in Milan in 1571, the first child of Fermo Merisi and his second wife, Lucia Aratori. Fermo was maggiordomo and architect to Francesco Sforza, Marquis of Caravaggio, who had residences both in the Lombard capital, where Caravaggio was born, and his nearby ancestral seat of Caravaggio, near the border with Venetian territory. His father died in 1577, and in 1584 the young Michelangelo was apprenticed to the Bergamasque painter Simone Peterzano, a pupil of Titian, for a period of 4 years. Nothing is known about his art in Milan, though it seems likely that he specialized in portraits and still life. But his North Italian background and training had far-reaching consequences for his art. An interest in evocative light and color, a precise handling of paint, which was more finished than that of the Venetians, even while retaining traces of their textured brushwork, a fondness for the sometimes ugly detail of nature, an interest in still life, detail, and portraiture. Caravaggio came to Rome around 1592 with no reputation and no money, and his first Roman years were harsh. The early biographers and few extant documents together suggest a young artist moving restlessly from studio to studio in search of employment, carrying out humble tasks. Of all Caravaggio's purported Roman residencies, the first may have been with Monsignor Pandolfo Pucci, but Caravaggio, forced to do unpleasant household chores and fed on a diet of salad, left within few months, dubbing his benefactor Monsignor Insalata, Monsignor Salad. At some point, he ended up in the workshop of one of the most successful painters of the time in Rome, Giuseppe Cesari, known as the Cavaliere d'Arpino. Bellori states that Caravaggio was employed by the Cavaliere to paint flowers and fruits. The first paintings by Caravaggio, which had come down to us, must have been painted at this time. The sick little Bacchus, the one on the left, is almost certainly a self-portrait, painted with the help of a mirror. Together with a boy holding a basket of fruit, which is now on view here at the Getty Center, the painting, so the sick Bacchus and the boy with the basket of fruit, the painting came into the possession of Cardinal Scipione Borghese when his uncle, Pope Paul V, seized the contents of Cavaliere d'Arpino's studio in 1607. Therefore, it is highly probable that these two paintings were executed for the open market when Caravaggio was working in d'Arpino's workshop. With a self-confident, almost challenging gaze, the youth presents us with a wicker basket overflowing with fruit. Red, black, and white grapes, apples, pears, apricots, and figs bursting open. Grape, pear, and lemon leaves complement an opulent and sensual bouquet, almost as aromatic and luscious as it is tactile and visual. Calling to mind Caravaggio's famous assertion that painting still lifes required as much artistry as painting figures. And so in this way, already rejecting in some way traditional hierarchies inherited from the Renaissance, which saw figure painting, history painting, mythological painting at the top of the hierarchy of painting, and still lifes and portrait in the lower kind of level. The youth's distinctive features have suggested to some that he represents one of Caravaggio's good friends, the Sicilian painter Mario Minniti, who was 16 at the time. Yet, as if calling attention to his own artifice, Caravaggio, in some way, in a very subtle and revolutionary way, combined aspects of portraiture, genre painting, and also allusion to mythology. The figure, in fact, was also interpreted as a portrait of Vertumnus, the Roman god of season and plant growth. And Caravaggio does so with unprecedented freedom and also a calculated ambiguity. We find the same ambiguity in the Bacchus today at the Uffizi in Florence, a painting probably executed when Caravaggio was already under the protection of his first important patron, Cardinal del Monte, who was in some way the ambassador of the Medici, of the Grand Duke of Tuscany in Rome. In fact, he was living in the Palazzo Madama, who was property of the Medici. And Cardinal del Monte was really the first important patron, the one who discovered Caravaggio, who took him from the road and gave him a place in his palace as, in some way, an artist of the household. And so the Bacchus probably was painted for Cardinal del Monte as a gift to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinando de' Medici. So this is why it's the Uffizi today. The half-length figure of a youth in antique-style dress is depicted reclining on a Greek couch, or kline, but very rustic, very rough. You can see the mattress with the stripes here. He has turned his head, profusely wreathed in vine leaves, and looks self-confidently out toward the viewer. Like the other paintings, we have always this gaze directed towards the viewer. With his left hand, he seems to be offering a glass cup of wine. A bowl piled high with fruit and a glass carafe are arranged upon a tabletop running parallel to the pictorial plane. Every detail testifies to the most accurate observation of nature. The god of wine is characterized by his traditional attributes and at the same time brought to life a disturbingly modern way by his naturalistic portrait features. Again, we are in front of a contemporary young boy dressed as a Bacchus, and the entire mise-en-scène is totally staged. As in the boy with the basket of fruit, the still life component is an essential part of the picture, a component which will become protagonist in the famous basket of fruit from the Pinacoteca Ambrosiana in Milan, a painting which is first mentioned in 1607 in the will of Cardinal Federico Borromeo in Milan, perhaps another gift of Cardinal del Monte to an important prelate and colleague in some way, like was Federico Borromeo. Together with examples by the Lombard painters Ambrogio Figino and Fede Galizia, and the first floral still lifes produced by young Bruegel the Elder in Rome, Caravaggio's basket of fruit belongs to the founding works of the genre. The independent still life is really the creation of the late 16th, early 17th century. Before, we don't have any example of independent still life. Despite the fruits are rendered with impressive naturalism, Caravaggio here simultaneously and almost paradoxically emphasizes both the flatness and depth. The flatness with this sort of neutral background, but also the depth because the basket is right on the edge of this sort of table, perhaps, or this parapet. And there is a cast shadow here, small, that. So he's emphasizing both the flatness and depth of his representation, transforming it into an allegory of the art of painting and challenging the viewer to reflect upon the character and the peculiar nature of painting as two-dimensional fiction. The Hermitage lute player, painted for one of Caravaggio's very first admirers, Marquess Vincenzo Giustiniani, epitomizes the complex cross-currents of the painter's early Roman style. Like the majority of his secular pictures from the 1590s, it is a half-length, almost certainly painted directly from life, and also feature a prominent still life, this time of flowers and some fruits. It is essentially a demonstration piece designed to show off the painter's skill in representing both the human figure and naturalistic still life. The intensity of presence and idiosyncrasy of mood of the painting is the result of painting directly from a posed model in the studio. Caravaggio reconstructs the reality of a corner of a room with all its accidents of light and shadow. Nothing that will enhance the illusion of reality is ignored, from keenly observed details to the strategic foregrounding of objects. His insistence on recording and even exaggerating distinctive details runs contrary to the generalizing conventions of Renaissance art, though it has precedence in that of Northern Italy and Northern Europe. This passion for verisimilitude extends also to the human models, who seem to be rendered with remarkably little idealization, and even with such features as dirty fingernails emphasized polemically, in the Bacchus, for example. Caravaggio's evocative and spatially suggestive observation of the play of light includes both cast shadows and the reflection of windows, buildings, and even people in water or wine-filled glass vases or decanters. In his incipient Baroque effort to abolish the distinction between the world of the picture and that of the spectator, Caravaggio dramatically locates objects right up against the picture plane, displaying or even proffering them to the viewer. This is really clear, both in the Bacchus and in the lute player, as you can see with the beautiful viola, the sheets of music, these vegetables. He introduces also another device, very important, that was to become central to his mature religious work, a diagonal shaft of light slanting across the back wall, this thing, which assumes a pictorial and expressive function, for it not only animates the monotony of the black wall, but also serves to emphasize a dramatic moment or indicate the presence of the divine. We will see developing this later on in his career. This seems to be exactly the function that light plays in one of Caravaggio's earliest examples of religious picture, the poignant Mary Magdalene today in the Galleria Doria Pamphili in Rome. And you can see here the same device of the light coming in from the left and the sort of... And I placed here a photograph of Tilda Swinton, the actress Tilda Swinton, interpreting this sort of painting in the famous movie of 1986 by Derek Jarman, one of the most beautiful movies ever done, I think, on Caravaggio and his art. The saint is sitting on an unusually low chair in a barely defined interior. Caravaggio shows us not the beautiful sinner with a taste for luxuries or the penitent woman, but the fleeting moment of the conversion. Mary Magdalene is still wearing her fashionably patterned brocade dress and has only just removed her jewelry and placed it on the ground next to the chair. The small glass jar might contain perfume or ointment and thereby refers with deliberate ambiguity both to Mary Magdalene's lives before her conversion or to the penitent sinner who anoints Christ's feet. The young woman is not distinguished by a halo, and so at first sight the painting might seem to be a pure genre scene. This is precisely what Bellori's description tries to convey. Bellori writes, "La finse per Maddalena," so he portrayed a woman as a Magdalene, in conjunction with the reproach that the painter had focused his attention solely upon the naturalistic representation of the model and thereby neglected the higher principles of art, lasciando da parte gli alti pensieri dell'arte, writes Bellori. Novel and unsettling is the portrait-like depiction of the saint in contemporary clothing, a device that aimed to encourage the viewer's empathy and identification. Caravaggio effected in the Magdalene a radically prophetic decontextualization, at once modernizing, as seen in the tiled floor and in the girl's dress, and universalizing. The setting of a dim, bare chamber, punctuated by light from an external source, will become, as we have seen, the preferred existential space of his mature art. Second chapter. Between July 23rd, 1599 and July 4th, 1600, Caravaggio painted two large canvases, the Calling of St. Matthew, here, and the Martyrdom of St. Matthew, for the side walls of the Contarelli Chapel in San Luigi dei Francesi in Rome, his first public commission. The commission was awarded by the Fabbrica of St. Peter's, probably on the advice of Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, who I already mentioned, the first important patron of the artist in Rome, in final fulfillment of the will of the French Cardinal Mathieu Cointrel, which is Italianized in Contarelli, to celebrate his memory through the deeds of his name saint, Matteo. These two large paintings won Caravaggio immense fame as a painter of religious subjects and led to an uninterrupted flow of commissions, both for churches and private collections. He was elected to the Accademia di San Luca almost at the same time. In the two St. Matthew histories, Caravaggio created a new and emotive combination that remained fundamental to his art. Realistic figure types allied to bold chiaroscuro, so the strong contrast of light and shadow. The pictures appear to relate to two alternative kinds of studio lighting used by Caravaggio during the ensuing years. Sunlight from a high side window, as seen in the Calling, so the side, and an illumination in a dark room from a lamp placed high above the models, which may have been employed in the Martyrdom. The fact that Caravaggio always lit his models from above indicates that he was well aware that such lighting enhances three-dimensionality. Caravaggio's lighting was part of the same militantly realist agenda that informed his close adherence to the appearance of his models in his earlier pictures. This agenda, however, would not have been sufficient to create such remarkable images, were if not for Caravaggio's intuitive grasp of dramatic form. In the Calling, the main source of illumination is high up on the right. In the Martyrdom, on the left. These correspond to the direction of the action in both pictures, with the light in them intended to mimic the daylight entering the chapel from a window above the altar. So above the altar, and you have the light entering on the two sides of the two paintings. The light in both cases can be read as a symbol or even the agent of the divine will. In the calling, the light on the wall sweeps past the figures of Christ and his companion who have just entered the counting house as if it were a superior force directing their endeavors, paralleling Christ's gathering gesture. Here, he's calling St. Matthew to the discipleship. Paralleling Christ's gathering gesture as he summons the tax gatherer Levi, the future Matthew, to the discipleship. So Matthew, as you know, was a tax gatherer, and then he was, in this moment, he changed his life because Christ is calling him to the discipleship. He's saying, you have to change life and to follow me, basically. In the martyrdom, the pools of light that pick out the saint and his assassin alike, as well as parts of the sinuous angel who leans down from a cloud to hand Matthew his palm of martyrdom, forcefully convey the idea of heavenly sanction for this second and final harvesting of the saint back to God. The Contarelli narratives are great pieces of theatre, heralding the illusionism and theatricality of high Baroque art. Their consummate illusionism is to make appear as if sacred events are taking place in the space of the chapel, and right in front of our eyes. It is an impression that is heightened here as elsewhere by Caravaggio's eloquent deployment of both modern and biblical costumes. So here we have, these figures are in modern costumes. Christ and his companion are in sort of antique dress, in tunics, in sort of antique biblical costumes. In the early 1600s, flushed with success, Caravaggio pursued his provocative agenda in a succession of altarpieces for side chapels in the churches and easel paintings for private collectors. However, his ostentatious rhetoric of the real was not always to the liking of church authorities, who considered that many of the sacred figures lacked decorum, the big criticism later on of Bellori. 3 out of the 5 altarpieces that he delivered between 1602 and 1606 were either rejected outright or soon taken down. The Matthew and the Angel, commissioned in 1599 to complete his work on the Contarelli Chapel, and for which Caravaggio made a replacement some years later. So this is the first version of the St. Matthew. So the painting you have seen in the altar at the center of the Contarelli Chapel. The first version is the one on your left and was rejected, and was unfortunately later on was bought by Marquis Vincenzo Giustiniani. The Giustiniani collection ended up in Berlin, and this painting unfortunately was lost during the Second World War. And also the Death of the Virgin, executed for Laerzio's Cherubini Chapel in Santa Maria della Scala in Trastevere, and the Madonna of the Serpent, painted for the altar of the Papal Grooms in St. Peter's, all altarpieces which were rejected. According to Bellori, the St. Matthew was rejected because the figure, and I quote, with its legs crossed and its feet rudely exposed to the public, had neither decorum nor the appearance of the saint. So these feet here. Similar factors seems to have pertained in the case of the Death of the Virgin, not least as regards the indecorous portrayal of the Virgin. According to different sources, Caravaggio had used either a live or drowned prostitute as his model, and there is certainly a corpse-like like cast to his plain and bloated Virgin, with her lower legs exposed to reveal swollen ankles and twisted toes. In his replacement, some years later, Carlo Saraceni, the painting on your right, prettified her countenance and covered her legs, and also added the more traditional chorus of angels above. The Madonna of the Serpent, a politically correct work that symbolizes the extirpation of heresy, was also thought to be flawed in its characterization of sacred figures. Bellori, again, was surely right when he pinpointed the vulgar depiction of the Virgin with the large décolleté, of the nude and pretty big child, pretty nude but pretty big Christ child, and of Saint Anne as an old Roman gypsy, like with all her wrinkles well described. In any case, the three altarpieces were almost immediately bought by three important art collectors. Marquess Vincenzo Giustiniani bought the St. Matthew, the Duke of Mantua Vincenzo Gonzaga, on the suggestion of the painter Peter Paul Rubens, who was in Rome at the time, bought the Death of the Virgin, and Cardinal Scipione Borghese bought the Madonna dei Palafrenieri, which is still today in the Galleria Borghese. Caravaggio was given a free rein to pursue his experiments by a number of sympathetic and wealthy private collectors, notably Vincenzo Giustiniani and the brothers Ciriaco, Asdrubale, and Bernardino Mattei. For Ciriaco Mattei, Caravaggio painted The Taking of Christ, rediscovered in 1990 in Dublin. It was known through copies before, and it was one of the great discoveries about Caravaggio in the last 30 years. The painting occupies an important position among the artist's religious history paintings. The relief-like composition combines three main incidents: the betrayal and arrest of Christ and the flight of the disciples, synchronously into a single dramatic narrative. Like his religious history paintings as a whole, Caravaggio's Taking of Christ aims, above all, to bring the biblical event to life. While the figures on the left half of the picture are dressed in antique-style tunics, the soldiers are characterized by their decidedly contemporary armor. Holding a vital clue to the meaning of the picture is the companion with the lantern, which is, as we have seen, a self-portrait of Caravaggio, in whom it is possible to recognize the self-portrait of the artist. Standing on the edge of the composition and only indirectly involved in the events he is watching, he is nevertheless emphasized by the bright light falling upon his face and right hand. In this way, the painter himself becomes an eyewitness of the story of salvation and thus its privileged reporter. A very similar concept is developed in the Incredulity of St. Thomas, painted for Vincenzo Giustiniani. Here, Caravaggio's wish to convey the sensation of touch induced a very literal and equally melodramatic interpretation. Christ guides Thomas' finger right inside his wound, and both he and the onlookers wince at the impact. Their wrinkled brows, are a favorite device of Caravaggio's for conveying psychological tension. All of their gazes converge like rays upon the motif of the hands and the wound of Christ's side, and thereby infuse the act of looking and seeing with enormous intensity, lending radical pictorial expression to Thomas' need to assure himself of the truth and to confirm it with his own eyes. Furthermore, as if to lay all doubts about Christ's physical presence, Caravaggio dwelt intently on his body, gratuitously hitching up his robe to reveal his thigh here, the leg. To the circle of Caravaggio's Roman patrons and admirers, we should add Scipione Borghese. Immediately after his election in 1605, Pope Paul V appointed Scipione as a cardinal, making him the most powerful man within the city of Rome, and above all allowing him to increase the family properties and to indulge his great passion for collecting. Scipione was in fact not only an avid collector of classical sculptures and all master paintings, but also an active promoter of contemporary artists such as Orazio Gentileschi, Guido Reni, Lanfranco and Domenichino. But his name is inextricably linked to the names of Caravaggio and Bernini, that is to say, to the major painter and the major sculptor of the 17th century. And here, also as an homage to the Getty, to our collection and to the current exhibition, we can see our portrait bust of the Pope, Paul V Borghese by Bernini, a recent rediscovery and a great acquisition of my esteemed colleague Annelise Demas, who is with us tonight. And the bust, the very famous bust by Bernini of Cardinal Scipione Borghese in the Galleria Borghese. So the Galleria Borghese is today home of 14 works by Bernini between paintings and sculptures and 6 paintings by Caravaggio, the largest gathering of his works in a single collection. Painted for Cardinal Scipione Borghese, the Saint Jerome, now on view at the Getty, has been part of the Villa Borghese's collection since 1613. The composition, again, is neat and striking at the same time. Draped in a voluminous red cloak, the saint sits at a simple table, poring over an ancient tome, immersed in his studies. 2 additional volumes with an inkwell and a skull, juxtaposed with the saint's bold pate, form a simple yet dominant still life. In this painting, Caravaggio combined with extraordinary poignance 2 of the influential pictorial traditions associated with Jerome, the Doctor of the Church, at work on his seminal translation of the Bible, and the ascetic penitent and mystic God-seeker. Staged in the studio and illuminated again from the left by a concentrated light source, the scene is at once concise and monumental, emphasized by powerful and energetic brushstrokes. It will have a long-lasting impact on the following generation of painters. 3rd episode. The pressure of success and criticism may have played their part in further destabilizing Caravaggio's volatile character. And in the period from 1600 to 1606, as I already mentioned, he was frequently arraigned before the courts for a variety of offenses. The picaresque saga culminated in his fateful killing of Ranuccio Tomassoni in Rome on May 29, 1606, during a brawl occasioned by a disputed bet on a game of tennis, an event that forced him to flee the city under threat of capital punishment. He would never return. Caravaggio's last 4 years were restless ones. He traveled to Naples, then to Malta, and then to Sicily, and again back to Naples. In his monumental 7 Works of Mercy, completed in Naples by January 7, 1607, for the charitable confraternity of the Pio Monte della Misericordia, Caravaggio extended his passion for foregrounding his figures with bold foreshortenings against dark backgrounds, so preventing the eye from wandering too far into depth. A much more assured integration of naturalism with expression and dramatic impact remain top priorities. So much that the crowded painting is, in its complex, dynamic illusionism, perhaps the very first fully Baroque altarpiece. The painting, it is also distinguished by a new, unblinking sobriety of mood. Caravaggio's insights into human nature come closer than ever to the ardent religious zeal of the Counter-Reformation. In Malta, in 1608, he executed the horizontal beheading of St. John the Baptist for the oratory of the conventual church of Valletta. In this huge canvas, more than 3 meters tall and 5 meters long, it's enormous, gigantic canvas, Caravaggio expanded the empty space, transforming the upper part of the picture into an assertive void. This new spatial mode is tuned with another development. The location of figures back from the picture plane in a tight geometric grouping in which they are bound to each other with a minimum of gesture, minimum but essential, very strong, very striking. The figures are now smaller in relation to the setting, and because of these and their loss of assertive individuality, more insignificant in some way. The same is true, this is a detail of the signature, which is realized, fictively realized, Michelangelo with the blood streaming from the head, the beheaded head of the Baptist. Very impressive. Oh. No image. The same is true for the Burial of St. Lucy painted in Syracuse. But okay, we can go back to that. The combined effect of these strategies is to encourage a more detached and contemplative reading of the drama at arm's length, and a related sense of the fixed and tragic fate of men. These pictures attain a new emotional intensity, conveyed primarily by an almost total abandonment of any but the most essential gestures and a corresponding channeling of feeling into restrained postures and intense facial expressions. The downcast gaze, always a favorite of Caravaggio, but now imbued with a deeper sense of melancholy and pathos, becomes a leitmotif. It also acquires resonance from the fact that the focus of the attention for the onlookers is invariably in these two paintings, also in the Burial of St. Lucy that unfortunately we cannot see, is invariably on or near the ground. So the protagonist is on the ground, so the onlookers are looking downwards. The marked stylistic change which characterizes these later works is reflected also in a significant shift in technique. In his early years in Rome, Caravaggio seems to have employed a grey or grey-green ground typical of 16th century Lombard painters. The presence of grey immediately beneath the final picture layer plays an important role in determining the light tonality of the finished painted surface, which we have seen in his very early works. At some point, Caravaggio, at the beginning of the 17th century, around the year 1600, Caravaggio switched to darker grounds, especially a reddish-brown one, a change which appears closely bound to the evolution of his chiaroscuro. These darker grounds helped to absorb the middle tones and intensify shadows, the former enhancing tonal unity, the latter augmenting the effect of relief by establishing sharper contrast with the strongly lit areas. In his late years, when he was working more rapidly and was less concerned with finish, so in this period, Caravaggio allowed the ground to show through in several places and to act as a middle tone in its own right. Toward the end of his career, Caravaggio sometimes opted for even darker grounds, which included a good deal of black. For example, in the Martyrdom of St. Ursula here, and in the David from the Galleria Borghese. In the Martyrdom of St. Ursula, painted for Marcantonio Doria, one of the last pictures by Caravaggio, we know from contemporary documents that the shipment of the painting from Naples to Genoa in May 1610, so 3 months before Caravaggio's death, was delayed because the varnish was not yet dry, and Caravaggio, we know, put the painting under the sun to quicker the process of drying the varnish. Caravaggio has, as usual, in this painting, Caravaggio has, as usual, focused his composition at the peak of the dramatic action. The figures are all seen in 3/4 length. Standing on the left, dressed in a red mantle and wearing a highly ornamental breastplate, is the king of the Huns. Rejected by Ursula, he has fired an arrow. He has the bow here, you see. He has fired, and he has just fired an arrow from almost point-blank range at the saint standing before him. So, Ursula. The arrow has lodged deep within the breast of the saint, who is seen in profile, draped in a red cloak. A fine stream of blood is spurting from the wound. The dramatic scene is determined by the physical proximity of the protagonists and the confrontation of the kings of the Huns, acting in the heat of passion, and the saint submitting to her fate. Caravaggio portraying himself again here, over the shoulder of the saint, with his face strongly lit, has made one more time himself a witness to and a privileged observer of the episode in the history of Christianity, which is thereby lent to a forceful actuality and translated into his own present. The economy of execution and the strictly limited palette, dominated by earth colors, red ochres, charcoal black, and lead white, is characteristic of the final phase of Caravaggio's career, when the artist reduces to the very essential his means of expression. David, with the head of Goliath, dates also from the last year of Caravaggio's career. The youthful shepherd boy, pensive and melancholic rather than jubilant in victory, holds his sword in his right hand and brandishes the terrifying head of Goliath in his outstretched left arm. Blood streams from the severed head of the Philistine, who stares into the void with his mouth wide open and the light in his eyes now dim. It is almost as if his agonized cries were still audible. Completed during Caravaggio's last dramatic months of life, the picture has convincingly been interpreted as an avowal of guilt following the death of the young man in a brawl, and as a plea for forgiveness. Indeed, the head of Goliath bears the unmistakable features of Caravaggio himself. The painting was probably conceived as a gift to Cardinal Scipione Borghese, who had the power to pardon Caravaggio for the murder and to allow his return to Rome. In such a context, David acquires an altogether new significance, with Caravaggio offering up to the art-loving Borghese his fictive head instead of the real one. But the painting becomes almost a meditation on his own mortality, demonstrating Caravaggio's gift for distilling his dramatic experience into original sacred imagery. That transcends the personal to become a searing statement of the human condition. The artist was not to enjoy the pleasure of delivering it in person. When news that the pardon from the Pope was granted reached Naples, the painter sailed toward Rome. But when his boat put into Porto Ercole, Caravaggio was mistaken for someone else and arrested. Although released after 2 days, he contracted a fever and he died there, alone and destitute, within a week, on July 10, 1610. Thank you very much. Even if it was a little bit long, I'm sorry. Maybe there will be some questions. I'm happy to answer if I can.
Davide, could you talk a little bit about his experience in Malta? Was he there for a very long period of time?
So in Naples, when he left Rome in May June 1606, he went to Naples. In Naples he was very successful, he painted several paintings, but his dream, he had a sort of also social ambition, and so his dream was to become a Knight of Malta, and the Grand Maestro of the Order of Malta, Alof de Vignacourt at the time, was an admirer of him. So probably it was Alof de Vignacourt who summoned Caravaggio to Malta, also promising him probably to become a Knight of Malta at some point. And in fact, his first months in Malta were very successful. He painted a portrait of Alof de Vignacourt, which is today in the Louvre in Paris. He painted a Saint Jerome for the Church of Valletta, painted a huge canvas. So he executed several very successful works. He was very admired. But then again, he went into trouble. There was a big fight with another knight, and he was knighted actually in 1607, I think, at the end of 1607, or when he was in Malta. Or maybe in the beginning of 1608. And so he was knighted, and then there was this big fight. He was arrested, and he escaped again. So he took a boat, and he had to leave Malta. And actually this caused him much more problems than with the papal justice, because while the Papa, even if he killed someone in Rome, the papal justice, the papal justice was not really after him, but instead the Knights of Malta, they want to pursue him. So he was really, then he went to Sicily, went to Messina, then to Palermo, and then from Palermo back to Naples, because he was in some way followed by Knights of Malta, or people who wanted in some way to take vengeance. And in fact, in Naples, when he went back to Naples, he was attacked by some people we don't know, but probably this was part of they were coming from Malta, and he was attacked and wounded, and badly wounded. So we know this from some documents. So the Malta moment is very important, and there was a connection, but then unfortunately then his personality, his character was really problematic in some way. Yes.
Thank you for an excellent talk. It's really fascinating.
Thank you.
Could you speak more about finding the Caravaggio in Dublin? I didn't know anything about that.
So the Taking of Christ, I have to say, one of my favorite paintings. Oh, we cannot go back. Oh, yes. Let's go back to the... So the Taking of Christ was known through several copies. There are several copies of this painting. In particular, there is one very good copy in Odessa, in Russia, and it was very well known to Roberto Longhi, who considered the painting probably the lost painting at the time when Roberto Longhi was writing, one of the most important Caravaggio's compositions in Rome. And it was rediscovered by a curator and scholar from the National Gallery of Dublin, of Ireland in Dublin, in a house of certain nuns in Dublin. He was hanging high up on a wall. It was dirty, but he kind of understood that maybe this was the original. And so they cleaned it, he published it, and then some Italian scholars made a lot of documentary discoveries about the painting. They found all the history that was a painting commissioned by Ciriaco Mattei, and then it was in the Mattei Palace, and they were able to reconstruct the entire story, the entire provenance of the painting, how he ended up in Scotland and then in Ireland. So it's one of the, I think it's the most important Caravaggio's rediscovery in recent years. As you know, often there are paintings that they come up and they are, there is a lot of rumor they are by Caravaggio, but it's almost never true. But in this case, it was a great rediscovery, and it's a wonderful, wonderful painting.
What are the European painters who are most influenced by Caravaggio, and what are the elements of his paintings which influence them most? The light, etc.
Sorry, you asked which painters he influenced?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So Caravaggio, he had a very large following immediately after his death, and he had some sort of pupils, but they were not the most famous of the painters. But there was a large following of Italian and foreign painters that in Rome were working in Rome, and for which Caravaggio's paintings were very, very important. Some names in Italian painters: Bartolomeo Manfredi, Dutch, Gerrit van Honthorst. We have a wonderful painting by him at the Getty. French followers, Valentin de Boulogne, later on Georges de la Tour. So he had a vast European, but I think his impact was very important also for Diego Velázquez in Spain. Velázquez made a very important trip in Rome in 1629, 1630 when he was young, and Caravaggio had a very important impact on him. And even if Rembrandt probably never traveled to Italy, but through some paintings, there was a very important painting by Caravaggio which was possible to see in Northern Europe, the Madonna of the Rosary, which is today in Vienna, but at the time was in Antwerp. And these sort of followers of Caravaggio, the language of Caravaggio, the bold chiaroscuro, the naturalism, was extremely influential also for Rembrandt. So I think most of the most important 17th century painters are in some way inconceivable without Caravaggio's precedent. But then there was the opposite faction, the faction of the idealists, so the ones for whom painting should represent ideal figures, and so there is a different, there are two sort of different factions at work in the 17th century. I hope I answer to your question.
You had mentioned that no letters or correspondence or notebooks have surfaced over the years. Is that because they were believed to have been destroyed, or did he just not keep them?
Probably there were, but they were destroyed. But there, many 16th century, early 17th century painters, they had really sort of intellectual ambitions to write their ideas about painting or to write treatises. Some of them just kept account books. For Caravaggio, we don't have nothing similar, but in some way this is also true with the other great Italian contemporary of Caravaggio, and in some way not rival, because we know that Caravaggio the only painter that Caravaggio really esteemed in Rome was Annibale Carracci. And it's famous that at some point in 1602, Caravaggio executed two paintings, very famous, you probably know them, I didn't show tonight, two paintings for the Cerasi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, the Crucifixion of St. Peter and the Conversion of St. Paul. And these are two paintings on the side of the chapel. Like in the Contarelli Chapel, I saw there are the two side paintings, and then there is one on the altarpiece. But in the Cerasi Chapel, the two side paintings are by Caravaggio, but the painting in the altarpiece is by Annibale Carracci. And when Caravaggio saw the Assumption of the Virgin by Annibale Carracci, he said, we know from a source, he said, at least in Rome there is another painter. So he he recognized that Annibale was in some way a painter at his own level. But also Annibale Carracci in some way didn't leave really literary traces. And it's famous that Annibale once told to his brother, who on the contrary has literary and poetical ambitions, he said, noi pittori dobbiamo parlare con le mani, so we painter, we have to talk with our hands. And so in some way, these two great painters are associated with this idea of not leaving trace in writing, but just with their works. Yes.
I'd like to continue on this lost and found theme. There was, I believe, the St. Matthew rejected altarpiece that was ultimately destroyed or lost in Berlin, if
Yes.
I remember correctly. It was destroyed by fire or disappeared in a Nazi collection and we don't know.
So, yeah, this is a very good question. So we know that at some point, some of the most important works, paintings and sculptures from the museums in Berlin were kept inside this tower, the Flakturm, in an area just outside from Berlin. And just after the war finished, so I think in May 1945, when Russian troops, and they were already in the area, this tower, there was a fire, a big fire in the tower. And so we assume that most of the paintings were lost in the fire. And among them, I think three Caravaggio, because the portrait, the St. Matthew, the first version of the St. Matthew, the portrait of the Cartezan I show, and another religious picture. And also many sculptures were lost, but recently some of the sculptures that were considered lost re-emerged in Russia, in the storages of the, but very badly damaged, but in the storages of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. But I really think that the paintings, because the sculptures that re-emerge are really fragments, all burned, and so I assume that the paintings are really lost. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Davide for his rich, detailed, and not very long presentation. And we'd like to remind you that the Caravaggio exhibit will be on show until February the 18th, so don't miss it before it goes back to Rome. Thank you once again to Davide Gasparotto and the Getty Center. Thank you.